All right, joining us now, of course, you know our good friend, who I think we literally about 2 years ago made her debut. We were covering the World Series. She made her debut on this show, and now 2 years later, she's on her way to Oklahoma City for the first time. Jenna Becerra, podcast host, analyst on the Pac-12 Network, and of course, Stanford alum, joining us here with a big smile, and rightfully so. I don't even have to ask you how you're doing. You're doing good, right?
I'm doing great. I told you I'm stressed, right? Just with all the planning and logistics with the alums, but this is a champagne problem that I will take every single year if I can. So
It is very successful too for the Pac-12, which we'll get into. But I want to start with Stanford because you and I talked. I remember in the preseason show about the expectations for this team. I picked them for the World Series, as you recall. That turned out to be correct, rightfully so. But now that it's happened, because it was not smooth sailings, as we'll get into. What's your feelings now that Stanford, Jessica Allister, and the Cardinal are back in the World Series, first time in 19 years when she was a catcher for Stanford? Your thoughts there after beating Duke in two straight?
there's a lot of thoughts, right? Like there's the analyst and announcer in me that on the one hand is like, I'm not surprised. We've been talking about this all season long, like what they have in their arsenal. And then there's the other side of me that's just full of pride, right? Like as an alum to see what has become of the program, particularly since Coach Allister has taken it over. I mean, myself, my classmates played for her as an assistant coach early in our careers at Stanford. And, she's the common denominator. Like her freshman year in 2001 is when Stanford went. 2004 was her senior year, second time they went. And this third time, her sixth season as a head coach. So I'm like, I think I even tweeted this, like, I'm not a math major, but I think I can spot the common denominator here with her in particular. So I think from that perspective, really proud, and also proud for them kind of getting back to some of the success that we had. Like when I played, so many things where I look at stats and things now for prep for broadcast, it's like, oh, last time was in 2009, 2010, 11, 12. I'm like, well, that's when I played. And now they're sort of getting back to that and then making it their own, which I think is really cool to witness and to cover. And then just from a softball media perspective and just someone who covers the sport, this is a good example of, they maybe were kind of quietly under the radar a little bit, especially early in the season, but this is why it matters. And sometimes, sometimes it isn't just about the long ball, right? Sometimes it is about having an excellent pitching staff and solid defense and some of that more fundamental softball, which is how they win ball games.
What went through your mind? It might have been 8:30 in the morning, which is a whole other story on Saturday when that last out was recorded and Stanford advanced to the World Series. The game got moved up due to weather, because we'll get to the start times about all that Duke in a moment. But what went through your mind when that last out was recorded?
Just a mix of just joy for them, pride, and then even some relief, because just from my own experience, like not to make it about me, but just as an alum who had been in that situation before at super regionals, twice we were so close. We won the first game. We're part of that like 19% that wins the first game and then doesn't go to the World Series twice, and so the fact that they got over that hump just made me so happy for them. So I think for that, I it's like I cried, kind of like I tried to cry, but also like just had no more energy at that point, because it was just so much investment, I think, throughout the season. But the conversations with all the alumni and everything have been awesome. All the group chats are, they're there anyway, but they've been blowing up, and we are so happy and excited.
Not an easy road. You got seeded ninth, which was kind of questionable. I had you top 8. I think a lot of people did. It was interesting that the committee nitpicked some of the stuff about Stanford's resume, but yet didn't nitpick one like Alabama, for example. That's my opinion. Whatever. I'm the bracketology. But the point is, you didn't have an easy road. You started off with Long Beach State, which was playing red hot. That was a 1-0 game. That was a dangerous 4 seed. You got Florida in your draw, which, it's a Tim Walton-led head coach. I know they're, say what they want about their, they're not the, quote, Florida teams from years past. They're still Florida with a top 3 finalist for National Player of the Year in Skylar Wallace. So you had to get through them. Then you got to fly all the way out to Durham, get assigned a 9 a.m. first pitch on a Friday, and then because of weather concerns, get moved up to a 6 a.m. Pacific time time there. That is not an easy road. I mean, you earned this deal. Just talk about this road for Stanford, because it was not easy. You got to see it up close in Palo Alto and moving forward, but this was a unique route for Stanford.
It certainly was. And it was one of those things where you have mixed feelings, right? Because the initial reaction is like, of course, they should have been higher than 9. And I think most people, especially on the Twitterverse, you could see agreed with that, right? When you take a look at the top 5 RPI and top strength of schedule in the country, these are things that we've been told in the past by the committee matter a lot. And they crushed it, and they've been ranked in the top 10 for weeks and weeks. And they get to the semifinals in the Pac-12 tournament. You know, they have a top finalist for player of the year, as well as Nigeria Kennedy, a top 3 finalist for freshman of the year nationally. There are so many things in the back pocket. But then now we're told there's this basically a moving target where it's like, well, top 10 wins matter, top 25 wins matter. And it feels like this, like I said, a moving target. That's what it feels like, because you're told one thing and then it's changed without sort of any warning and not a ton of explanation. But at the same time, I actually saw Tori Tyson tweeted this. She said, Stanford softball just showed us that the only way to prove that you were seeded incorrectly is to win. And that's true, because at the end of the day, you still have to win ball games. You know, it's like, if you want to get to Oklahoma City, you're going to play the best of the best to get there. So you still have to do it. And we used to always talk about this so what mentality. Bad weather, so what? 2 outs, so what? 2 strikes, so what? 6 a.m. Pacific time game start, so what? You know, and they just want to play. That is the essence of who Coach Alistair is as a person, just wanting to compete. And it trickles down to the whole team. So should they have gotten a better draw? Absolutely. You know, getting Florida sent and like and the other 2, right? Like with Long Beach State and even LMU. I mean, these are these are conference champions too, you know. That's tough. Also, I would argue a very tough draw for Florida to have to come, not only travel, but to go to Stanford. And then, yeah, you know, facing a team like Duke as well. But at the end of the day, I think they got it done. You know, and that's what proves things the most.
Do you think, now that you've gotten to the World Series, because I kind of agree with everything you said there, do you think this was one of those things where they're like, hey, you know, and I, you know, committees will always deny this, but the fact that Stanford hasn't been to the World Series in recent years, whereas say another program like a Washington has, maybe that's one of the reasons you didn't get that favorable draw, because you haven't been to the World Series recently, whereas others, not that that's right, I'm not justifying it, but I'm wondering if that played a factor, you know, from a seeding, you know, from a draw standpoint and a seeding standpoint. The Long Beach State and the Loyola, that's all about the 400-mile radius thing, which, sure, you know, it's a whole other story we don't have time for. But I did wonder, you know, because, you know, I've talked to Coach Alistair for many years. She's never gotten the benefit of the doubt on a seed, as we know, going back to her days in Minnesota. So I just wonder if it was one of those things, now that you've broken through, is maybe now you'll get more better draws. Not even, I don't want to say better draws, but more maybe fair draws down the road. I know it's not right, but do you buy into that conspiracy theory?
I mean, it's hard. It feels like something is there, right? Or like something slightly off. So when there feels like something slightly off, it makes you think like, well, it's hard not to think that maybe there's something like that, even if it's subconscious, like even if it's not consciously in the front of the minds of people on the committee, you know, but just the visibility piece. Maybe it's just easier to watch like some of the SEC games and the ACC games because they're on ESPN. It's really that simple, and they shouldn't feel bad about being on ESPN. I mean, that's been fantastic for the growth of our sport. It's just that sometimes the full picture, I don't think, is understood by not just the committee, but in a general sense on the national landscape for softball. So do I think it probably affected it? It might have. It might have. Just the fact that this is a run for them, you know, a new run for them. And it's hard not to think that there's maybe a little something like that too, when you see, for example, like obviously UCLA didn't make it, so it didn't matter from that perspective. But when you see, you know, there's only a handful of Pac-12 teams compared to how many teams in other conferences got into the tournament, and they're set to face each other in super regionals initially, and even first game in the Women's College World Series, it's Utah and Washington, right? Like it's hard to not think there's something there. So yeah, I mean, it's tough to not think that when you don't have the actual exact answers.
I'm curious, as a student athlete, were you bothered by the start times you got in Durham? And look, that's television. Let's be real about that. because I liked your matchup against Duke. I saw Duke in person; they're a good team, but I thought you matched up very well with them. But when I saw the start times, I was concerned because that from a West Coast, that's a 3-hour difference body language. I know you travel earlier in the trip, and so you try to adjust to it. But I'll never forget David Shaw, the former Stanford head coach, bring up the time zone difference many years ago when Stanford lost at Northwestern, and it was a noon kickoff on television. Was that a concern to you at all? Or am I making too big of a deal of that?
It's not too big of a deal because it's a factor, and I think all factors, especially from the outside looking in when we're covering the sport, like need to be acknowledged, right? So I don't think it's too big of a deal. You do have to, as a student athlete, to your question, like not worry about that stuff. Like you do have to just focus on what the task at hand is and have that so what mentality. But from, more of a zoomed out perspective, yeah, it's not great. And you're right. I think there's a lot of gamesmanship in football in general with some of the East Coast, West Coast matchups, because I think not long after that, I want to say Stanford also scheduled maybe with like Notre Dame or something, a noon kickoff noon kickoff Pacific. I don't know. They've both done it to each other, to try to, or was it like a 10 a.m. kickoff? I don't know. Something early or something late, 7 p.m. kickoff, something like that. And I think like that goes into it. But when you are playing, and this is sometimes when I'm in the media, when I have the media hat on too, where I feel both sides a lot, because you're really taught to just block out all that noise when you're playing and when you're coaching and actually competing. But like the media is considering and discussing all that noise, so sometimes I'm like, oh, I don't want to be worried about that. But really, like, that is what this is to a certain degree. So it's like always about finding that balance for me. But yeah, was it totally fair? Probably not. At the same time, I could tell you that Coach Alistair would much rather get the game in than try to start later and it be delays because of rain and all kinds of things in the meantime. Like, she'd rather play and the team would rather play. So as long as they're getting that chance to play, I think that's what matters most to them.
Well, clearly it didn't affect them because they took care of business. I want to start with the offense because obviously the pitching's gotten all the attention, and rightfully so. We'll get to that. But my question about Stan, I think I told you this even before the year and throughout the year, is the offense good enough? I knew the arms were, but the offense, at times when they had some hiccups, and listen, when you're playing in the Pac-12, you're going to have hiccups. But when you had the hiccups, you didn't score runs. That was my question. Boy, they delivered. Talk about this offense in this postseason. What have you seen?
I think that's actually been, no doubt, Niger Kennedy has been an incredible addition and elevated the pitching staff. But, and freshman River Mailer, right? So those two have been big time as newbies in the lineup. But outside of that, really, I think the offense adjustments have been the biggest difference between this year's team and last year's team. Because last year it was kind of like, if they were struggling hitting, they might not make those adjustments throughout the rest of the game. This year, that has not been the case. Even if early on, the first time through the lineup, there's a bit of a struggle, they still fight. They fought a lot last year too, but I'm seeing more at-bat to at-bat adjustments from this offense. Taylor Gindelsberger is a great example. She's one of the leaders on the team, and she's a, triple threat on the left side. So she reads things really well. Also one of the best base runners I think I've ever seen, and not just because of speed, but because of how she reads and how she cuts corners. Like, that is underrated as well. But there are some hitters like that on this Stanford team that can make adjustments. And it's really that mental piece too, where it's like, just because A happened in my first at bat doesn't mean that has to happen in this at bat and at bat B. So I feel like that is what has changed. And they've been able to be more clutch. It's the timeliness. I mean, that's exactly what happened in game 1 against Duke. It was like a no-hitter for several innings, but it was the timing of the hits. And it's because they made adjustments. Caitlin Lim, another good example.
No doubt. I thought that was especially in game 2, they kind of pulled away there and they would respond. But obviously, a lot of the nation got to see the freshman Phenom Kennedy there. Speak to her because, I remember talking to Coach Alistair. She was excited about her. She was excited about the staff. But I never envisioned her being like basically a co-number 1. Like, she got the game 1 ball. She closed the door in game 2. I mean, Elena Vaughter's resume speaks for itself. Yet, she kind of took that at a level. Speak to her because, now we understand why you guys kind of struggled. Stanford struggled a little bit when she was out with an injury. Clearly, she's a difference maker. Speak to her. From you seeing her as well as anyone in person, what makes her as electric?
She has all the tools, and the way Coach Alistair puts it as well is that she's a very mature player. So it's not she doesn't get rattled very easily. She might get a little bit anxious, like, "Ooh, I'm antsy. I'm really pumped up for this," but she doesn't get rattled. She wants the ball. I think that was an exact quote nearly that she said when I interviewed her recently on Believe in Softball, is like, "I want the ball in those situations." So I think that from the mental side, but then when you just look at the way she executes, she can throw in the 70s. She's got a lot of movement on top of it, especially with that rise ball. She can throw it at different levels, so she changes planes, and she does have a changeup. She doesn't throw it all the time, but she has the ability to change speeds. And when I saw that in the fall, just during their inner squads, that made me excited, because there's a good amount of freshmen who come in and don't necessarily have a good off speed or a good changeup, but she already had that as an option, and you have to at this level. So she can change planes, change speeds, and she can locate really well. I think that is the key too, because it's one thing to have velocity and movement. It's another thing to be precise and paint the corners in that way as a pitcher. She can do all of those things. And she's just a great compliment as well to Elena Vaughter. The thing is, too, is there's way more film on Elena Vaughter, right? Like, especially after what she did last year. So I do want like that to be understood as well. Like, Nigel's brand new. So people hadn't seen her before, and even going up against UCLA in this epic, battle in the Pac-12 tournament, they hadn't seen her because she was out for part of the time during the Pac-12 regular season. So the complementary piece, though, of Vaughter also having that drop ball, it's like they're very different. They're very different, so they can complement each other really well. And people should also acknowledge Reagan Krause, because she is that third piece to the puzzle, that she was huge when it came to them winning the Tuscaloosa Regional last year and moving on. And not only that, but earlier in the season as well, she has 2 no-hitters this year. Like, she is a solid piece of support for that pitching staff too. But I think it's the way that they work together. They also are each other's biggest fans. And I think that makes a difference, because they're all happy for each other. They all help each other. They communicate. And sometimes it's not always that way between teammates who play the same position. But for them, Tori Nyberg has created that atmosphere and environment in the bullpen. And she should get a ton of credit, by the way, because she's outstanding.
No doubt. Coach Alistair told me when I had her on the show before the season, this felt that was the best staff she's ever had, either at Stanford or Minnesota, which is saying something. But she was proven correct on that, which is why I think that could benefit you here as you get to Oklahoma City in this double elimination format, which we'll get into a little bit. But I want to ask you about Coach Alistair, because I think of all the head coaches in OKC this year, nothing against the other 7, but the one that I'm the happiest the most for is Coach Alistair, who I think has been one of the best coaches in the sport. And finally, as a coach, gets that, I don't know if you want to call it a monkey off her back or whatever, but now could say she's been to the World Series as a head coach. We all know, well documented, the Minnesota year in 2017 and what transpired there. But she came back home to our alma mater to build this program from the bottom back up. Honest, I think you'd be honest if you'd agree with me on that. Stanford was not in great shape when she came in. Build it back up. There were people that were questioning her for taking the job, to say, "Can you win here?" And I kept asking her, "Can you win there?" It's like, absolutely. And has built this program up bit by bit. Getting to the tournament and regionals in Gainesville, getting to the Supers last year, winning that first regional in Tuscaloosa, and now to the World Series. Speak to her as someone who has seen her behind the scenes and all the hard work she does in building this program.
She is a fierce competitor, but also a fierce person in sense of looking out for the people that are around her. And I think both of those things really contribute to the culture, which has been the difference maker for Stanford. That's what she helped reestablish. And you see that in the results. That's the thing, is like we often only our society tends to just measure things on well, what are the end results, but it's the process. She focuses so much on that process that's what gets you those results in the end. And, her first year in 2018 was a tough one. She's coming off of having a #1 ranking, the highest ever for Minnesota at one point in 2017, to having to restart a program essentially from scratch is what it feels like when you come into Stanford at that point. They have a similar record, not that different, but they felt different. I remember her saying that specifically too. We felt different than the season prior. Then in 2019, it's just a steady climb. 2019, they make it to postseason, the NCAA appearance, first one since 2013. So first one in 6 years. 2020, the season was shortened, but it was the best start they had had in a decade as a program in terms of wins and losses. 2021, they make it to the regional final. They don't move on to Supers, but they made it to the final in that regional. 2022, they obviously won regionals in Tuscaloosa, move on to supers, end up hosting. And then this year they get the national seed and they're going to the Women's College World Series. So she just keeps pushing. She just keeps pushing, but she's also smart about it. I think that's something that we all need to remember at times, just in different parts of our lives. It's a great reminder for me when I watch her work, is it's not just working hard, it's working smart too. People were really questioning, why aren't we seeing Nyjah Kennedy, early in the Pac-12 season? And the point was to make sure that that rest she was getting was worth it for the long term. And now she's able to do this in the postseason because they were smart about it and she cared about her as a person. So that's just one example of what she does so well.
Yeah, I've always enjoyed talking to her because she, as you know, she's one that will not get sucked into any media narrative. So you gotta be, you gotta ask the right questions, or she'll make it real clear that she's not appreciative of the question. But one of my favorite conversations I ever had with her, it's funny you bring up 2021, was when they were in Fayetteville. It's the day before the Fayetteville Regional. And she explained that was a challenging year because of COVID. California was restricted. So she didn't literally have her players start till like right before the season, which you think about is kind of nuts. And she admitted that they had to adjust as the year was going on because they were behind. And she said it was one of the more challenging schedules. And I really appreciated her candor about that. And I've always enjoyed, but I thought, to me, it was one of the more underrated head coaching jobs she's ever done. I think she should be a national head coach of the year this year with the job she's done with this program. When was the turning point for you? Did you always believe this was going to happen? Did you have doubts? When was that moment where you're like, okay, I'm in, I bought in?
I think the second she was hired, the alumni, at least, the ones who knew her, who were either her teammates or played for her in some sort of coaching capacity, knew that this was a big deal. I mean, the second it was announced, Ramona Shelburne's thrilled, Jessica Mendoza's thrilled. They were her teammates. All of us who she recruited and who she coached us, at least in an assistant coach capacity, we were thrilled. I think we knew that it could happen. We knew it was going to take time, and it did to get here, but we knew that it could the second that she was hired because we knew what she was capable of. And like I said, she's the common denominator at this point with the World Series appearances that Stanford has. I think it was just a matter of like, who's able to push this program back to what it was. And we knew that she had that ability, because it's one thing to maintain a great program. It's another thing to get the program there, and vice versa. Like now it's like, okay, you've gotten to the World Series. What do we do now? And I'm sure she'll be thinking about that as they move forward, right? How to maintain that and even just try to continue to get better. So we all knew. We knew. We weren't surprised. We weren't.
I'm going to ask you this because if I ask her, she'll hate the question and just deflect it. But I think she has to be one of the great Cardinal alums from what she accomplished as a player, but now as a coach, I feel like she needs to be recognized in a bigger picture, right? Like right there with the Mendozas and the Mike Marquez, the legendary baseball coach, and Tiger Woods, obviously there, John McEnroe's an alum. I know she hates that kind of conversation, but what she's done as a player now as a head coach, she needs to be recognized by her university. Am I accurate on that?
Yeah, 100%. 100%. And I do think, my conversations just within the athletic department, it's the institution knows that they have a good one. Like, we have a good one here in place, and we know we're lucky. So that always helps too, when you understand and value the person that you have in that leadership position. But yes, I mean, she was an All-American catcher, again, went to both previous Women's College World Series. And she played with some of the greats as well, like Mendoza, for example. But she played professional softball too, and she's been coaching for a really long time and did what she did at Minnesota before Stanford. And then you apply like that extra layer of you're home now at your alma mater, and it only led to, I think, even more productivity from her. So yeah, I do. I think she's a little bit underrated. And you're right. When I ask her about anything that is even touches on how good she is, she's like, I don't know about that. I don't want to have this conversation. And I'm like, well, you can do it. We can do hard things. Coach Al, you can answer these questions, but she wants to leave it out on the field, but she does. She does.
You mentioned Mendoza. She will be there for ESPN calling the World Series. I think there's a good chance she will be calling one of these Stanford games, if not the first one against Oklahoma, just based on the pairings and the broadcast. So that in itself is a storyline in itself, since obviously Mendoza, with Stanford, that's going to be a storyline. I don't know about Ramona Shelburne's status. Obviously, there's the NBA finals that's going to be going on. I don't know if that affects her role, but I would imagine she might try to make an effort. That'd be kind of a cool storyline angle, personally. There, I might need your assistance on that if that is how it's developed. You've taught. What is the alumni reaction? What's the feedback? How much turnout are you expecting there at Oklahoma City?
I think a lot of people are interested. I mean, that's what I've been doing all day today is trying to organize alumni get-togethers, getting tickets in the same spot so we can spend time together, all of that stuff. There are players from the 2004 team that played with Coach Alistair, played with some of the other great alums at Stanford that are coming. You know, some other All-Americans like Dana Sorensen has said she's going to come, which is fantastic. Sarah Beeson, I think, is hoping to come. I did talk to Ramona. It is very difficult with the NBA schedule right now, but she's like, I mean, it would be great if I could stop over, you know? So not to like put her on the spot, but she'll try. You know, I think everyone is trying to go all in. And a lot of us have talked about like, it's been too long. Like we want to be all in on this. And even if they're playing Oklahoma first, it's like, let's try to make it a little more Cardinal in Oklahoma City.
I like that, a little more Cardinal. Stanford will not be alone there representing the Pac-12. Utah is there, as is Washington as well. Another successful Pac-12 tournament, despite the fact that UCLA was knocked out in the regionals, which is arguably the biggest upset in the NCAA tournament history, and the fact that Arizona missed the NCAA tournament for the first time since 1986. Your thoughts on the Pac-12? That's kind of a wild, wording I just described. A successful Pac-12 tournament run in the NCAA tournament without UCLA, basically, in Arizona.
It is pretty wild when you take a step back. I mean, the two institutions who are responsible for 20 national championships between them and UCLA and Arizona, that's half of the national championships that exist. Are not even in it at this point. So that's wild. But I think it's important to note that, yes, once again, the Pac-12 is sending the most teams to the Women's College World Series. I think that speaks to sort of that national narrative, not always including the whole picture at times. It's important to note that last year that was the case as well with 3 teams, and they were 3 different teams. They were not the same 3 teams that are being sent this year. Like this year, there's Washington, Utah, and Stanford. Last year, it was obviously UCLA, Arizona, and Oregon State. So to see that just within 2 years, I think that speaks to the level of the conference as well, because, you know, it's the highest proportion too. If you look at how many teams got in from like the Power 5 conferences to how many teams actually advanced, for the Pac-12, half who got into the NCAA tournament. There were 6, 3 are moving on to the Women's College World Series. And if you compare that to some other conferences, for example, 12 teams got in for the SEC, 2 are moving on to the Women's College World Series. So that's 50% to about 16, 17%. You know, just thinking about those types of proportions. And it doesn't tell the entire story, but it tells a story, I think, which is that the Pac-12 is underestimated, but to really the more important point, it's a conference that is incredibly battle tested, and that shows in the postseason. And they are only on the rise. Even some of the teams that were in the lower portion of the Pac-12 in terms of results, they're on the rise. You can't hide anywhere. I mean, Utah didn't make postseason last year, and now not only are they going to the World Series, but they hosted both rounds for regionals and supers. That is insane, you know. And I think there's only more good things to come from the Pac-12.
Agreed. I mean, the RPI has been back and forth all year between the Pac-12 and the Big 12 as far as the best conference RPI-wise, not the SEC, to your point on that. But I also think the Pac-12 adapting has helped. In particular, the Pac-12 tournament, Jenna, which I think you would agree was a massive success, because without the Pac-12 tournament, Utah doesn't get an opportunity to make that run, beat Washington, beat UCLA in the final, which put them in position to host. Without the Pac-12 tournament, I don't think Utah hosts. That was huge for Amy Hogan Company. So let's give I think the Pac-12 adapting has helped there. But let's talk about the Utes making it to the World Series, winning a very difficult regional, beating the Ole Miss and Baylor in that regional, and then in the Supers against a very well-coached San Diego State team with Stacey Newman, Denise there. Your thoughts on Amy Hogan, the Utes, making it to the World Series?
I am thrilled Thrilled for them. I mean, for the Stanford alums, right? We're talking about 19 years since the last time. For them, it's 29 years. It is crazy that it's a new millennium basically for them and them being able to go. But I wrote a story about this team earlier in the season, sort of in the middle of Pac-12 regular season, about their approach this season. One of the coolest stories about Utah, and this came from DJ Gasso and Paige Parker. So this was an Oklahoma concept. So like giving that credit as well to sort of that coaching tree and some of those concepts, and Amy Hogue being open to it. They had an 1176 challenge, which was their workout challenge in the off season. And it was representative of the 1,176 miles between Salt Lake City and Oklahoma City. And they just pushed themselves further than they thought they could. And this was strength and conditioning things. This was on the field. This was even on the track. This was doing all kinds of different things with weights and running, etc. And they often, even now, will talk about how looking back on getting through those workouts helps them push themselves now, especially through the hard, like losing game 1 to San Diego State. So the fact that now, after that 1176 challenge, they are going to make that trip over those, 1,000 plus miles to Oklahoma City, I think it's just what a storybook season that they've been able to put together. Also agree with you that the Pac-12 tournament was huge. And I think the coaches knew that, which is why they mostly, like all the coaches, were very excited about it. It's an exposure thing. It's a tournament feel before the NCAA tournament thing. And it's just getting those types of reps and that sort of team experience too for your players. I mean, that Nigel Kennedy, for example, gets experience doing a tournament style play before the NCAA tournament because of that. And because Utah did what they did, I absolutely think that helped them with the committee, which was part of the goal of the tournament in the first place.
Trust me, I know. I was watching Utah UCLA game. I had to change my bracket as soon as Utah won because I had them kind of at the outside looking in, but they beat UCLA, which is a big blue chip win. So I stayed up till 4 a.m. to read through the bracket.
Pac-12 after dark.
Maybe the committee should consider doing that too. Anyway, so Washington, maybe the most improbable run, just because of where they came from. They were 3 outs away, down 6-0 to McNeese in the regional. Looked like they were done. They were about to be doubled up by McNeese, about to lose at home for the second year in a row. You're thinking, well, this young pitching staff was too young and everything like that. And they mount maybe the greatest comeback, the largest comeback in 23 years of the NCAA in the NCAA tournament history. 23 years. Comeback somehow, miraculously comeback, beat McNeese. And I'll never forget Heather Tarr was interviewed on that telecast, and I've known Heather for a while, about as emotional as I've ever seen her in that game, and the players rally around her. I think that momentum just clearly went over to the Supers as they took care of Louisiana. Just your thoughts on the Huskies, an amazing, remarkable run there for Heather Tarr and the Huskies, who have a lot of momentum coming in.
That super regional game was the regional game, excuse me, was one of the greatest comebacks I've ever seen. I don't know if I've ever seen a team score 7 runs in the 7th inning the way that they did against McNeese. Like that was absolutely incredible. And it was really interesting because at the beginning of that inning, when McNeese was up 6-0, I was on the phone with my dad. We're just chatting about, the tournament, what's going on. And he was like, every time you ever played Washington and every time I've watched them, they never have that fear in their eyes when they're at the plate. They just don't have that doubt. And I'm like, I think, yeah, you're right. I mean, there's a whole lot that they're going to have to deal with right now if they want to continue. But yeah, that's true. And then they do it. And it's not only that they do it, but some of the biggest people step up. Like Sammy Reynolds getting that 3 RBI hit was one of the most poetic things ever. And it's like, how can you not have chills? How can you not be romantic about softball, when you see something like that? And I think that is a testament to what Heather Tarr has built, as well as just the grittiness of, again, it's a battle-tested conference in the Pac-12, so they know what these types of fights are all about. And having had that experience potentially in the Pac-12 tournament right before that might have helped as well, because they had an interesting game against Utah, right? And there are some factors like that I think may have helped as well. But, the freshman Ruby Malin as well being such an impact this year, I think they just don't quit. Like you can never count them out ever. And they've proved that more than ever in this postseason so far.
That's right. And they will open up with Utah, which I believe that's going to be their 5th meeting this year.
Yep. 5 times. Yeah.
What do you make of that matchup?
I think it's one of the most interesting matchups. I mean, when Washington took the series 2 out of 3, but like they were really going back and forth in the regular season series between those 2 teams in Seattle. Then you fast forward to the Pac-12 tournament and Utah, in that pressure moment, like they come out on top. But they are such an interesting matchup. So I am so curious to see in this environment in Oklahoma City, the first time in so long that Utah has been there, and that even the players on the team, including the 5th years, haven't experienced postseason at all until this year. So it's going to be brand new to them. But for Washington, it's been since 2019. So most folks aren't very familiar with it either, on their team at that level, at the World Series level. So I think it's going to be actually about managing emotions a lot, because they both have tools to win. I think, Utah's speed, I think, is underrated too, as well. Because it is a huge asset for them, but they've played each other so many times too. I really do think it's going to be more mental and emotional than anything else at this point.
You're right. That Utah offense, DJ Gasso, shout out to him, man. I had him on the show. He gets ridiculed because, oh, well, did you get the job because you're the Gasso? I think he's proven he's a legit coach. This might be the best offense in the Andy Hogue era they've ever had. In fact, it is. I think most stolen bases, most runs scored ever. And that's going to be a big national storyline. Obviously, the fact that he's there with JT and Patty, their family. I mean, that's a 1 in a million storyline right there.
Of course.
Which is kind of wild there from their standpoint. And then Washington, I feel like they're kind of playing with house money, because this was a young Washington team, especially in the circle. This is all valuable experience for Coach Tarr and the Huskies there. Give me your thoughts on the field of 8 overall.
I think it's interesting. I think it's interesting. And I think it shows in some ways the growth of the sport to what I was saying earlier. Like you look at, okay, well, once again, the Pac-12 sends 3, they have the most teams that are going, but they're 3 different teams. And it's not the 2 big ones in UCLA and Arizona, like we said earlier. I think that's interesting to look at. The fact that Tennessee is back, like they were solid all season long. So I don't think anyone's surprised who's been watching this season, but they just haven't been there in a while. So the fact that they're back, I think, shows is another example of, in a different conference, like being a little bit on the rise again in this game. And then you look at, the Big 12 with the Oklahomas. I don't think anyone thought that OU was ever a question mark, even though it was so close against Clemson at the end there. But that is OU in a nutshell, though. They, down to their final strike, down to anything, it doesn't matter. It has to be over for it to be over, because that is how they are. Talk about not having any fear in your eyes, right? And Oklahoma State has figured something out from the end of the regular season till now to get to this point. So I think that's interesting. I was hoping to see some sort of representation from the Big Ten, because I do think that conference is underrated. I often talk about the Pac-12 because that's what I cover in depth the most, but I do think that conference is underrated, and Northwestern specifically was underrated. But, Alabama can't count them out either, clearly. Like, that is such a scrappy team, and they're never going to quit. It's the same thing, so
yeah,
what an interesting mix of fan bases, I think, that we're going to see in Oklahoma City as well.
I feel for Northwestern. They should have been a top 8 seed. I tweeted that out. Carol Hutchins, by the way, the former legendary Michigan head coach, agreed with me. So I have that on my to toot. Like, I get to toot my own horn on that one. Not many people. If Hutch agrees with me, I feel good about my opinion on it. I think they should have been a top 8 seed. They should have been hosting Alabama, not the other way around. That's just my thoughts on that. But that's a whole other story. That's unfortunate for them. That's a great group, a very classy group. Coach Drohan and company. They do a fantastic job there, as you know very well. What they've done there. Let's talk about Stanford and Oklahoma. I'm actually excited about this matchup to see the Stanford pitching staff against that Oklahoma offense. I think this is the best pitching staff Oklahoma has seen all year. Obviously, this is probably the best offense the Stanford staff's going to see. Contrast of styles, but with Coach Alistair, I know they're going to be ready to play. What are you looking forward to seeing that first day when you're there in the park? In that matchup, obviously, it's going to be a lot of Sooner fans. You're going to be introduced to that. But, I think it's a fascinating matchup. And it's a tough matchup for Oklahoma. Remember, 2 years ago, Odyssey Alexander beat them there in a 1 versus 8. So I'm really intrigued by that game.
Absolutely. I think it would be silly not to be, and the thing about it is both teams, I think one of the things that makes OU great is that they consistently stick to their game. I don't think they allow themselves to get overwhelmed by their environment. I don't think they allow what the other team is doing to affect what they're doing too much, other than obviously necessary adjustments that have to be made. But I think they just stick to OU softball constantly and consistently. And that's how they're able to not only have the talent that they have, but execute using that talent so much day in and day out. I think Stanford, a big reason why the success has increased has been their ability to do that, to stick to Stanford softball and just stay focused. And that has a lot to do with Coach Allister's leadership, and her style is really just focusing on like, what is the plan, and really like tuning out everything else, just focusing on one thing at a time and being where your feet are. I think that makes a huge difference. Remembering to have fun too. I think that's something that I've noticed even more so than when I played. The Stanford team, they smile probably more than we did. They are having more fun. And Coach Allister talks about that too. She's actually like, enjoy this. She talked about that at the Pac-12 tournament when I travel with the team. She's like, enjoy it. You've earned this. Stay focused, of course, but it's like, enjoy this. Like, enjoy what you're now experiencing. And obviously we know Oklahoma's great at doing that as well. So I think just from like that sort of more intangible side of things, I think that's going to be interesting. And it's sort of this like, the queens really in Oklahoma and just what they've been doing and going for the three-peat and all that stuff with like the at least recently new kids on the block. It's just such an interesting clash that I think it'd be crazy not to be like, wow, this is going to be such an interesting matchup to watch.
Agreed. Agree 100%. I'm looking forward to it. Look, it starts on Thursday. You're going to be there. You need to have fun. I know this is something you're looking forward to. This is because you said this is your first trip to OKC.
Yes, I played, travel ball. Nationals were there growing up. So I've played on the field, done all that, but we did not make it there when I was in college. We were close twice, did not go there. So
what are you looking for? What are you looking forward as a spectator to checking out? What's the thing you're looking forward to the most?
I think the environment, like the feeling of the crowds. That is something that is hard to ever replace when you're an athlete. And if you are no longer playing a sport at that point anymore, or no longer coaching, right? Like in the arena like that. It's hard to really explain that experience, and it's hard to replicate that experience after that. But when you get to be a fan and you feel like you have a dog in the fight with your team there, I feel like that environment just means a little bit more, in that case. And with that being said, I'm looking forward to being with my teammates. We tried and we fought to get to Oklahoma City together when we played. We didn't make it. Now we get to go together to support this program that we're a part of forever. So I think just enjoying that time, the same way I said that they're enjoying that experience on the field, like we want to enjoy that in the stands and supporting them as well.
Well, I'm excited for you. I'm super excited for you to make this trip. What's going to happen with the podcast? Like, go ahead. This is a great. What a time to promote the pod. Normally, this is the time where I tell you promote the podcast. I'm kind of intrigued what you're going to do. This is a first for you here. A podcast where you're traveling to OKC.
I know. Well, it's interesting because I have some interviews already queued up for this World Series time. But yeah, we'll see. I'm actually still trying to figure it out too. I'm trying to be a little bit more flexible, and just see. We've had this like weekly set up and a very consistent sort of release with content historically, but now it's a new opportunity. So I don't know. I can't tell you exactly. Expect something new, or expect some new stuff on social, at least I would say. But we'll see. All
right. Where do the people go follow it?
It's Believe in Softball on the Believe Network. So it's BLEAV. It's on YouTube, as well as all your standard audio podcast platforms, Apple, Spotify, all that good stuff. And you can follow Believe in Softball on Twitter and Instagram as well. And then me at Jenna Becerra and at Jenna Becerra01 on Instagram and Twitter, respectively.
Well, and I have a feeling you'll be joining us at some point during this World Series as well, as we talk throughout the World Series when we do our shows, live shows, etc., which we're finalizing as we speak. But in the meantime, hey, enjoy it, all right? Trust me, that's a cool experience you're about to have. Enjoy it. Try to take it all in. And thanks for doing this on a busy time as you're planning all this out, literally getting ready to pack and head out there. Have fun, and we'll talk to you from Oklahoma City.
Yeah, I'm excited. And before I forget, because I feel the need to make the call out, didn't talk a lot about the ACC, but Florida State with Lonnie Alameda, who also was a longtime Stanford assistant
Oh, that's
coach.
right.
So many people played for her too. So I think a lot of Stanford alums are very excited to obviously see her there on that stage in person. But I think the ACC is knocking on the door as well. You look at Duke, you look at Clemson. I mean, they are right there. So you asked about like what I thought about the field of eight. I think we're going to see more ACC teams soon, even if it
Yeah.
wasn't this year. But
Yeah.
just had to say that.
No, that's a great angle. I forgot the angle. See, that's why you're on the show. You know all the storylines, angles. I forgot that, Lonnie. You're right with the Stanford connection. That's a very good one. And hey, look, Coach Rittman pushed Oklahoma there in that game too. That was the most dramatic game of the Super Regional. Perhaps some blueprints there that showed there, perhaps in knocking off Oklahoma. So plenty of storylines. You're going to be on top of it, I know, over there in OKC, Jenna. Enjoy.
Yeah. Thank you again. Love always coming on the show. So this was fun.